Good evening and welcome to Face the Nation. Now, Sri Lanka is undertaking a series of reform programs to recover from successive crises and build resilience against future shocks. An IMF mission team visited Sri Lanka last month to discuss recent macroeconomic developments and progress in implementing economic and fiscal policies under the Extended Fund Facility arrangement, where the head of mission said the economic reform program implemented by the Sri Lankan authorities is yielding the first signs of recovery. I'd like to juxtapose this with the fact that rural communities in Sri Lanka bear a disproportionately heavier burden of vulnerability. Tonight's topic of discussion is economic stability, fact or fiction. We invite you to join the conversation tonight. I have a fabulous panel of guests this evening. I'm so pleased to invite to the studio Professor Dr. Howard Nicholas. He's an economist and social scientist, retired professor at Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Good evening and welcome, Professor. Dhananath Fernando, Chief Executive Officer of Advocata Institute, policy think tank in Sri Lanka. Welcome to the show, Dhananath.
Thank you, Sonali.
Economist Dhanusha Pathirana. Good evening and welcome, Dhanusha. And finally, Kanchana Ruwanpura, Professor of Development Geography at University of Gothenburg, Sweden, and co-founder of the Institute of Policy Economy, Sri Lanka. Good evening and welcome, Kanchana. I'll also be joined by Niresh Eliathambi, Consultant Director, Newsfirst. Evening, Niresh. And also Shihar Anis, Executive Director, Center for Investigative Reporting. Now, for the opening remarks, I'd first like to ask Dr. Howard Nicholas. You have 3 minutes on the clock.
Thank you very much, Sonali. Starting with this question of stability, reality or myth, it has to be admitted that there has been greater stability when we compare it to 2022, when we were in a terrible mess. Starting with petrol queues. There are no petrol queues anymore, and we don't have blackouts, so we have to admit that. However, we also have to note that electricity prices have risen by 66%, and a large number of people cannot afford their energy bills. So this is the qualification one needs to make. Second, it's true that inflation has fallen from over 90% to now under 10%. That's true. However, when inflation rose, we didn't see wages rising along with inflation. So in real terms, people are much, much poorer, especially the lower wage sectors of the society. And we have to admit that this has been further worsened by the tax increases. So there have been double blows to these people. Third thing is interest rates have indeed fallen. They were over 30%. Not loan rates, I might say. Loan rates never reached those heights. But they haven't fallen as much as expected. And one thing that we should note is that there are lots of non-performing loans. There are lots of companies either in bankruptcy or on the verge of bankruptcy. And one of the consequences we see is the enforcement of this Parata law, uniquely Sri Lankan, but devastating, especially to the SMEs. What I don't understand is why, when the government came into power, the present government, why they didn't introduce something like a Chapter 11. A Chapter 11 is what they have in the United States, where companies immediately get protection and no one can seize their assets. But in Sri Lanka, the assets immediately can be seized, and this is incredibly destructive. The last thing is, yes, we have seen reserves restored to a certain level, but we have to say that that restoration is fundamentally due to tourism coming back, remittances coming back, and the contributions of the donor community. What we are still waiting for is when the freeze on foreign debt repayments and services kicks in. So we haven't seen that yet, nor have we seen the full elimination of all the import controls. When those kick in, they're going to have a detrimental impact on the reserves. And one thing that needs to be emphasized here, the restoration of this reserve situation is not due to export earnings growth. Those have remained stagnant. And that's a very bad sign for Sri Lanka.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas. Danana Fernando.
So Sonali, in my view, the stability that we see is temporary, but there are signs of economies recovering. I mean, the main indicators are indicating, which is quite obvious, the inflation is coming down, as Professor Howard mentioned. So that temporary stability is there, but it doesn't mean that we call it like a honeymoon period. It's very temporary. It can go back to where we were, even few miles beyond where we were, if the structural reforms were not done. And that's what I think the electricity prices, inflation, tourism, export development, all these to kick in, there has to be structural reforms. What I mean by a structural reform is something that is difficult to reverse, and it's like the foundation of a building. When you have to have the proper foundation, the depth has to be enough, the structure has to be capable of bearing the weight of the entire structure. So for that, there has to be structural reforms, and that's only where the growth can kick in. To kick in, I think there are multiple reforms that we need to do, and one is definitely trade. That's where we can improve our exports. But it doesn't happen overnight, because we have been hanging around this 10 to 12 billion exports for a long time. And it won't happen miraculously unless we do those structural reforms. And that's where I think we always get stuck. Our economy has always been either in a crisis or a stability. Very rarely we have been on the growth trajectory, and that's what is exactly missing. And if we do not gear up for the growth reforms and to grow the economy, definitely it would be very difficult. So in terms of taking it forward from there, I would suggest to grow, definitely the trade reforms has to take place. That is on exports as well as on imports, because trade is always a two-way street. There's a lot of inefficiencies taking place at the state-owned enterprises reforms that has to be reformed in multiple ways. And I agree there has to be an insolvency chapter. I think government has initiated something, but I think it's very slow to move. That has to happen. But before all three, the social safety net has to be established. That's what we have been saying, because when a reform process is going on, it will definitely affect the poorest of the poor. And as what we have seen, 4 million of below the poverty line jumped up to 7 million. So we have to take care of that 7 million before any reforms takes place. And earlier we only had allocated 50 billion, and now we have allocated about 200 billion, which is not enough at all, because it's a very small amount. So those 4 reforms is the way forward I see in terms of moving forward.
All right, thank you very much. Danusha Pathirana.
Yeah, I think now it seems to me that this the apparent stability, as we call it, that the absence of fuel queues and so on, the blackouts, is being attributed to these so-called market reforms that this unmandated Ranil Rajapaksa government has carried throughout the last 1 year or so. But I would like to argue on the reverse. Now, if we go into the specific things that happened last year, when the Aragale was at its peak, and when the blackouts were running into 13-12 hours, and queues were long for like 2-3 kilometers, I think we also forgot to mention that at the same time the oil prices shot up like 100 to 150%. It was somewhere around $60 a barrel, and at around April to May, this shot up with the war in Ukraine and so many other reasons. This shot up to nearly 140 a barrel, and then this started coming down towards the end of the year. And at the same time, you have to look at the 3 main commodities that were in short supply. That was oil, gas, and coal. The domestically utilized gas, LP gas, and coal. So, and last two was the main ingredients or the raw materials where we used to produce energy. Now, if we take the price of coal, that went up by like 8 to 10 times. Similarly, the LP gas prices, you can check it online, right? So these prices started coming down. Of course, when there's a abnormal spike in world market prices, they don't last so long. And these were, I think, on top of the structural issues and also the borrowings and the foreign debt and all the issues we speak. The icing on the cake, or let me, if we can put it that way, the tipping point was that the sudden spike of these commodity prices in the global markets, and these started coming down towards the end of the year, and therefore the demand for dollars came down, and then the exchange rate, the rate became a bit more, the value of rupee went up. Compared to what it was somewhere around 380 or 75 $. Now it has come down to this level, and there are other reasons also. So and also people had some more confidence because the foreign exchange availability also increased. Now this has nothing to do with the reforms. This is what the point which I'm trying to raise here. The main the pivotal point of this so-called stability is outside the framework of governance that is happening right now in the country.
All right, Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura.
Thanks, Sonali. So I guess I'll pick up on the point that Dhananath made, that we've done structural reforms to have growth, but to me, the structural conditions are also about structural inequalities in the country, right? And so, in a sense, this discourse on stability in the country, if you kind of go beyond the numbers, the macroeconomic indicators, comes across to me as being quite oblivious to the deepening of income inequality, worsening poverty, and the multidimensional vulnerabilities which has been identified by the UNDP in 2022. So in a sense, we need to kind of really unpack a lot more what does this stabilization in Sri Lanka actually means when it comes to the people of the country, right? And to me, this cuts across all class spectrums and not just those who are quite privileged. The UN resident coordinator towards the end of last year, Marc-André Franch, he remarks that in 2022, interest payments on public debt accounted for more than 3/4 of total government revenue that went, and total more than what went to public expenditure on health and education combined. So this gives you a sense of where the money is actually going. It's not really coming inwards into the country, but going out. And so the effects of this debt crisis then has to really focus more than on growth, stabilization, macroeconomic indicators, to also pivot on equity issues. And in a sense, to my mind, if you really keep your eyes open when you're going around in Colombo alone, not just the rural areas, the debt crisis is also becoming an equity crisis, and if it hasn't already become one, right? And so we need to kind of ask questions around equity when we are talking about structural reforms. And as somebody who's worked on feminist issues around debt crisis, economic crisis, one of the things is that economic crisis also tends to be highly gendered. So the impacts on men and women are quite different. And in the case of Sri Lanka, this means neglecting 52% of our population, or not paying enough attention to 52% of our population. So is it growth vis-a-vis equity, or growth and equity that we're really talking about?
All right, thank you very much for your opening remarks. Before opening the floor for questions from our journalists, I have a question for Dr. Howard Nicholas. Dr. Nicholas, these existing austerity measures have impacted the standard of living and quality of life of the majority of Sri Lankans, but these are necessary measures. And since we are in an IMF-supported program, we have to comply. How must the government go about resurrecting the economy whilst also balancing the competing interests of citizen welfare and standard of living?
Well, the first part of my answer is actually the diagnosis was wrong. I think the IMF has the standard diagnosis for everyone, all countries, that basically it's mismanagement, excessive budget deficit, all these things normally come in with that diagnosis.
Okay.
And from my perspective, that was not the case. So we're talking about the foreign exchange crisis, and I think the start of it was this excessive borrowing during the previous tenure of Ranil Wickremesinghe, when he was Prime Minister from 2015 to 2019. They borrowed 10 billion in ISBs, 10 billion out of 17 billion from 2005 to 2019. 10 billion came in just 3.5 years there. And they borrowed it at a level of interest where any rational person would realize there's no chance of Sri Lanka ever meeting its repayment commitments. So why they did it is a mystery to me. I have no idea why they did such a thing. The second aspect of that is they constantly went on about printing money being the source of the foreign exchange crisis as well as domestic inflation. Now we understand this is not the case. Okay, there's now admission, and this admission has been like extracting teeth. There's been admission by principal advisors to Mr. Wickremesinghe that printing money does not cause inflation. But that was the basis for most of the policies that were implemented. Especially the austerity measures. Now, it's not to say that once you're in this crisis situation, you shouldn't cut the budget deficit. That you should. But a lot of the other policies that came with it, such as the Central Bank Act, were not warranted by the cause of the crisis. Okay, and so the question I always ask is, IMF is not oblivious of this. IMF knows what I know, and what now the advisors to Mr. Wickremesinghe know, that printing money has never caused inflation. There is no such thing. The Federal Reserve Chairman in 2021 told the Senate exactly what I'm now telling you, that there is no such thing that printing money causes inflation, and he added to that, I guess that all of us better relearn our economics. And I think this is where we stand at the moment, that this diagnosis was faulty and it led to unnecessary pain being inflicted on the ordinary population.
So how must the government go about
Well, that's the second part of the
competing?
story I would come to, and that is, I've been repeating it like a parrot. Sorry for repeating it. I think Dhananath has heard it millions of times, but you already alluded to it, Dhananath, and that is export-oriented industrialization. No country has ever, and I've studied it, the history of the global economy for 300 years, no country ever developed without export-oriented industrialization. What I get whenever I say that, people say, but there's always a first. So in the 1990s, I remember, I mean, it's good to be old. It's good to be great, because I remember the same arguments. Services, Sri Lanka is going to be a services experiment. And the first services we mentioned was computer programmers. I don't know if you remember it. We trained all these computer programmers. What did they do when they got their qualifications? Caught a plane and left. Then, late 1990s, a new ruse was created for us, and actually it came courtesy of the World Bank. Sri Lanka can be a financial hub for India. Seriously? Sri Lanka can be a financial hub like Hong Kong was for China? Can't be, because Hong Kong was a financial hub for China because China was at that stage a communist, closed economy. And Hong Kong was the vehicle through which a lot of foreign investors went to China. But has anyone visited Mumbai recently? Are you serious that Sri Lanka can be a financial hub? Now I hear the same story. I heard it yesterday again when I said export-oriented industrialization. We're in the world of IT. So we can develop IT in Sri Lanka, and that is our new vehicle. You know, so every single time we look for excuses not to do the only thing that has ever been successful.
All right, thank you very much. Niresh?
Yes, Dharana, we, ever since this bankruptcy came about, which was a couple of years ago, we keep hearing these catchphrases, reforms, and several other phrases like that. But we still hear those. Why is it so slow? Is the government paying enough attention? Because it seems like the government and Parliament seem to be focused on other things like online safety bills and anti-terrorism bills and things like that. Shouldn't they be focusing more attention on the reality of the country, the plight of the population?
Absolutely, Niresh. It was said in economics, the first principle is realizing the scarcity value of resources. But in politics, the first principle is forgetting the first principle in economics. So I think that's what is taking place. That's why for reforms it's slow, and of course it gives a massive negative signal when you bring bills like online safety bill, because the market is going to completely get confused when you have such negative signal. So I think that's one reason the reforms are slow under any government, because you're always prioritizing on your political agenda, keeping the economy aside. However, I just wanted to quickly, while I agree on the export side, the truth is, that's what I mentioned, the structural reforms are needed. If we are serious about export growth, about 95% of the BOI lands in the Western province are already occupied. So I, as a joke, say even Elon Musk comes, he doesn't have a land to invest. So without having that land ready, there is no way that we can grow exports. I'm not talking about like the private land. And the BOI hasn't done a single project, I think, for the last 8 years. That's one side. And on the other side, in terms of utilities and supply, it was quite weak. So there is no way, even if we want to bring the manufacturing and get it going, there are no lands available. And on the other side, there are about 16 licenses that you need to get if you were to run a FDI. And once I met an investor, he said, to get those 16 licenses, if you run it in full speed, it will take 2 years. If you run it in full speed. But generally, it takes about 3 to 4 years. So there is no way that we can attract investments for exports. I just wanted to comment also on the debt side. While I agree that my reasoning for the crisis is there was misfortunate and mismanagement, but we borrowed too much money in dollar terms in short maturity and invested in non-revenue generating assets or like liabilities in that sense. But I'm not sure whether this graph is visible. So if you look at in terms of, a lot of people are asking, okay, you have borrowed so much of money, where is the money? Where did you invest? Of course, some of the money have been stolen, but mainly 74% of our debt is to repay the interest, because it was snowballing, and also the currency depreciation. So those are the two main components of our debt problem, because when you borrow, let's say you borrow 1,000 rupees and your interest rate is 10%, so you have to pay 1,100, and to pay that 100 interest you have to borrow 20%, so then you are basically snowballing over a period of time. And that's what exactly this indicates. As you can see, the pink one, the purple one is about 40%, which is the interest. So that's on the other side. So that's the diagnostic of the debt side. Also, I respectfully disagree. I have a different view to Dr. Harvard on money printing versus inflation. I think we had got that bitter medicine because our inflation went up to 70%. I know there are different schools of thoughts, but in my view, that money printing caused quite a lot of harm, because it not only increased the inflation, it also created a forex shortage. Because in my analysis, when you have excess money, we are all going to spend it. And when we spend it, imagine I'm going and buying this phone, and this phone I'm buying it in rupees, but the shopkeeper is buying it in dollars. So the more that I spend, the more I bring demand for these imported items, and that's of course going to create a forex shortage. In my view, that's the knock-on impact, because we saw unprecedented level of money printing. That is also because very high government expenditure. On the other side, when you have that high level of money printing, of course people are going to increase their demand on the other side, and that creates a forex shortage. And that cannot be controlled just by import controls. If we can control that, of course we know from COVID till recently, all the imports were controlled. But how come then the currency went up from 200 to 360, even for 370? So in my analysis, with all due respect to Dr. Harvard, I have a different take on money printing and inflation.
Just to follow up, you just mentioned if we are serious about exports, is the government not serious about exports?
I do not see that they are serious, because if they are serious, there are structural reforms that needs to be done, and that is not happening. And even the FDIs that we have received is not on a competitive basis, or either it is driven with a tax holiday, which is not the best way to attract the investments. It has to be on a competitive basis, and it should boost the exports. That should be the main focus, and that's why, while our competing countries are attracting quite a lot of foreign direct investments, and we have been falling way behind. And even there's a geopolitical tension between China and US, and a lot of industries are moving out of China to Vietnam to Malaysia and even to India, the next door, but we have failed to capture those investments because our structure is not right, including land, including labor, including the red tape, the regulation. There are so many, I mean, our investment structure is set up in a way that you are basically saying the investors to go away. Our structure is to say go away, not to invest in Sri Lanka, is my view.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I think Dr. Howard interestingly explained lack of queues does not mean that the economy has recovered or stabilized, right? But in terms of macroeconomy, we see interest rates are coming down, the reserves are picking up, and the private sector currency is growing, right? And also the money printing is not there anymore. In your words, Doctor, and even Dhananath, you can answer. In your words, what does where have we missed the bus, or what have we done? What have we not done correct or right?
Well, the most basic one is, as I said, we have not consistently followed an export-oriented industrialization strategy, meaning producing manufactures for export and making sure that local companies are involved. You see, we also constantly keep talking about FDI. FDI without local companies leads nowhere. Foreigners are not just going to be producing and exporting and your economy growing unless you include local companies. All you have to do is look at the successful East Asians. The one thing they did was they promoted their own companies. So that's, for me, the starting point. But I come back to Dhananath. Printing money. We have to now bury this once and for all, Dhananath. Sorry. It's not a debate anymore. Sorry. It's not a debate because it's admitted by every central bank that central banks cannot print money. It's the commercial banks that print money. So what happens is when they make a loan, they deposit it into the account of whoever borrows. That means the money increases, the quantity of money increases. So after, 30-odd, 40 years, finally it has dawned on them and they finally admitted, and that's all of them, there's no exception anymore, printing money does not cause inflation. But it doesn't mean to say that government budget deficits don't cause inflation, or cause a balance of payments problem. That does. And therefore, there is a very simple remedy, not to stop the central bank buying debt. This is stupid. This is stupid. The remedy is you put debt ceilings. All the countries do this. And then you say there has to be a 2/3 majority for you to change the debt ceiling. This is a democracy. If you have an authoritarian regime, it's a different thing. But so we have to bury this because we are damaging our whole financial system with this central bank act. And it's based on a complete misunderstanding of the source of, let's say, the forex problem and inflation. Okay, so I think, I've at least convinced 3 of the advisors to the government to please go to the central bank sites and read the most recent take on inflation by these central banks who were always talking about printing money causes inflation and so on.
Sorry, so in the interest of time, I'm going to interject and for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, in Sri Lanka, the money printing authority is given to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka by Monetary Law Act number 58 of 1945. So yes, this money printing issue, which was a very political decision, has caused much controversy and hardship to Sri Lanka. I would like to park this issue now and move on to our topic of discussion, which is economic stability, fact or fiction, myth or reality. Kanchana, when we speak about the nexus between development, strictly speaking, the dictionary meaning of development, and welfare, in your opening remarks, you said that women are disproportionately impacted by the multiple crises. Could you take us through the gendered nature of crisis and how policy should address it? Because at the moment, I don't think there's much addressal of the gendered nature of the crisis. So let's collectively try to also, whilst identifying issues which we already have heard of so many times, also try and point to solutions, which is what I'd like to ask of our guests.
So you want me to start first?
Yes, please.
I mean, I guess, yes, to start with, there is no recognition that the debt crisis is also a gendered crisis. I mean, I haven't heard that. It's very few of us who've been interjecting and trying to make this point. So to start with your question, does development neglect welfare, or do you have to have development to have welfare, right?
Correct.
I'm paraphrasing, but okay. So to me, and perhaps I was initially trained in economics, I would have a more expansive understanding of development. Development is not just about growth or economic growth, as Dhananath kind of emphasized. This is an important aspect, but this is not the whole story. I mean, if you actually take Sri Lanka historically, and Harvard would know this, Sri Lanka, like Kerala and Cuba, was always upheld as examples of exemplar of countries that have low economic growth but high social development. So it is actually very possible to have robust welfare mechanisms in place without necessarily having this high economic growth, so to speak, right? So the gendered nature of it is, if we kind of take this very small thing, let's say electricity prices have gone up. You all pointed this out, right? I mean, it was pointed out by Harvard, etc. You take this from the national level, where everyone of a particular class in Colombo don't complain about, they're saying they don't have, they have electricity. Yes, you have to pay a price, but at least it's there all the time. We forget the fact that a significant proportion of Sri Lankans no longer have access to electricity, right? And this can affect households in different ways. So if you take a household of a low-income household, no electricity means usually families are kind of scrambling to see who can study, who gets the lamp and all this kind, for instance, right? And often what you see when there are crisis moments, it's girls who get left behind, or women who have to sacrifice. So I've read and heard so many people talking about, so many low-income families talking about, they have one meal a day, right? In this one meal a day, I would be curious to know who gets the better food even.
Sure.
Because the evidence elsewhere, and I'm sure if the evidence research was done for Sri Lanka, evidence elsewhere is that families who are distressed, often it's the women and the girls who end up having to pay the cost for it. So this is kind of the gendered nature of it. I'm just taking one example. How do we go about addressing this? I think to start with, we need to recognize that economic crises have differential impacts on men and women. That would be the starting point, right? Because without acknowledging that, we can talk about structural reforms, we can talk about all this kind of macroeconomic stabilization that we've heard about, but we're not really thinking about who are the beneficiaries of these reforms. How do people across the class spectrum benefit from it, right? How do women, working women who are, as Howard said, real wages have fallen, right? How do they have to then make concessions in how they manage their household budgets? This is one of the reasons why we have rural indebtedness increasing, for instance. Yeah.
That I want to ask this question from you. Now, we are talking about stability, right?
Yeah.
But what do you mean by stability now, in terms of after the crisis, and what does this mean for a person who is below the poverty line at the moment?
Exactly. Now, the sort of thing I would want to explain also. Thank you for asking that question. So now, there are, I think, two sides to this. Who are actually stable right now, and who have actually become more stable out of this crisis, which is, you look at the numbers, we look at I think there's a group of financial aristocrats, you may call them, right? They have consolidated their position and the access to wealth and resources in the financial system. Specifically, if you look into the numbers, it will be more evident. And whereas a large section of the entire population have collapsed into utter misery. Now, if I say a few things about how they have consolidated. Now, profits of the banking sector has shot up, something like 300 to 400%. You may have seen, like, CSC reports have come out on banking sector profits for 2023. The numbers are staggering. And if you dig in even more into the primary dealers, the individual companies, some of the companies have recorded 1,000% increase in their profits. Whereas we talk about people who are now not in queues waiting for fuel, and then not in dark, but then during the same period, we see now in July, the government basically said around 500,000 people or meters have been zero. That means to say their electricity has been cut off. These are, I assume that 500,000 meters, meaning that 500,000 families, because individually we don't take meters. And then by around October, September, this figure went up to 740,000. And by the end of the year, the Kanchana Wijesekara, the energy minister himself, declared that they disconnected over 1,060,000 meters during the end of 2023. So whereas one section of the business elite have consolidated and increased their wealth, access to wealth, a large section of the population, if you say 1,060,000 is, if you take at least 3 million people, and that's a significant amount of, if you take as a percentage of the population. So close to, let's say, 15 to 20%. And then if you take the malnourishment, now early this year, around March, it was stated by the UN, 17% of the population was facing acute malnourishment. By around October, they're saying it's now 24%, 1/4 of the population. And during the same period, 31% of the children are malnourished. Right? So now this is the stability they're talking about. Now this is the first time in history, I think, when the country is suffering like this, a government is like audacious enough to come forward and say, now we are stable. Like, who is stable? Who have become stable? This is what we need to ask. We can see some stability in the extra. This is what they mean, the IMF and everybody, who is actually so focused on the markets. What they mean by stability is the external sector, where the inflows and outflows of foreign exchange are balanced. But even within a market system, there are other markets. There is the labor market, there is the investments and savings market, right? So are they in stability, especially the labor market? We are seeing investors disappearing. Now, 20%, we see a 20% decline in garments exports, 9% decline in total exports. So we are seeing the same trend of exports to GDP declining, right? So it's the same non-tradables that are expanding, which actually, in a sense, that pushed us into this mess. So that process is continuing, and we are saying now it is stabilizing. So, but on the I leave that aside now, but I want to also focus on this exports growth idea that has been discussed here. Now, if I think we need to look at as Professor Nicholas also would say, the recent history of the East Asians and also the history of Europe, basically after the Great Depression, how they're thinking of the economy, how that all transformed. Now, if I borrow an example from late Professor S.B. De Silva, he would say, now, okay, now you're talking about exports. Imagine our entire country turned into an estate, tea estate, or a garment factory. What would that mean? Maybe you have enough foreign exchange end of the day, but what is the type of employment you are creating? These are what you call third world industries. So when you're talking about exports, you have to talk about the nature of the exports, whether these are industrial exports or what we call third world exports, where capital to labor ratio remains stable over time, so productivity does not expand, labor productivity. We need to bring in productive systems that combine with scientific knowledge. And that is not the case when it comes to Sri Lanka. We can't just speak about exports. Speaking about exports, you have to talk about its composition. And the current business elite, where common to this, a common problem in the third world, are incapable of making that transformation, because industrialization is a network of whole heap of industries. Now, if you take, say, producing a machine, it would require 150 component parts. So one industry leads to 101 other industries. So to supply that, you need a whole heap of integrated industries. Now, in the history of East Asia and also Europe, especially after the Great Depression, they came to this understanding that if you leave everything to the market, everything will collapse, right? There a huge section of the population will be left out, who will not be able to reproduce themselves as they would want to. So the state played a major role in industrially transforming the systems, where later on the private sector got used to that structure and you know, then followed that framework of investing, or framework of production. Now, this is the exact same thing which IMF and these Bretton Woods organizations, which actually propel economic imperialism in very subtle ways. They're posing it as like very liberal and this is good for you, not like the earlier forms of imperialism, where, you know, you bomb and invade a country and then, you know, take over their the economies and then exploit. But this is a total very subtle way of doing things, the debt and so on. Now, all this debt comes to all non-industrialized non-industrial infrastructure projects, which do not ultimately compete with the industrial structures of the developed capitalist countries. So we need to, the whole aim of these economic policies is to crush a state that would take you a path in a form of development that would challenge the established capitalist centers. So a state needs to understand what has happened in the history. The governments needs to understand what the developed capitalist countries, they themselves have done. They have not just opened up the market so that the export would just grow.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So from theory to practice, Dr. Nicholas, if I could have your perspectives on privatization of strategic industries, is it being prioritized correctly? How do you view this concept in Sri Lanka at the moment?
Well, I'm not averse to privatization per se. There are lots of state companies that are run inefficiently and are actually corrupt. I mean, they're actually there for various MPs to produce whatever they want to produce. When I was at the start of IPS, we conducted a survey, and we found out that there were so many companies that hadn't even produced accounts for the last 5 to 10 years. So we know that that sort of corruption is there, and there's no rationality for a lot of them to be state companies. But strategic sectors, and that's what you mentioned, and in particular I'm thinking of energy, this move towards increasing privatization of the energy sector is incredibly damaging, incredibly detrimental to the future prospects of the economy. And yesterday I was having a chat with a businessman and telling him this, and he said, I met a BASF person, BAS, the famous chemicals company in Germany, and he was so critical of the German government. Why? Because of their energy policy. Because energy prices have soared in Germany and made it impossible for German companies to work there. So they're migrating to China. Wow. Because the Chinese, like the Vietnamese and other East Asians, they subsidize energy. They have state control, and when there's a shock in the system, they don't let the energy prices soar. They've subsidized, and they've got a huge competitive advantage as well. We didn't do that. And we're going further down that road where we're privatizing and handing it over to actually our competing countries, So we have to be very careful with those things.
Could I just get back to Professor Kanchana here? You spoke of gender in this kind of crisis.
Yeah.
But it's not just gender, is it? It's the entire family unit. In the sense, over the last 2 years or so, the immigration department has issued about 2 million passports, and Sri Lankans don't get passports unless they're leaving.
Yeah.
So we presume 2 million Sri Lankans have left.
Yeah.
And they would be mostly the young people, not so much people in their 50s or 60s.
Yeah.
So what's this doing to our population? We already had a very old population.
Aging population.
Very aged. And now what's it going to do to the population now?
I mean, so...
Who's going to take care of
the elderly?
The elderly.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know if anyone knows, who is moving out of the country in terms of, what kind of occupations are they going for? Is it the domestic workers, for instance, or is it a different caliber of people who are traveling out of the country? I also don't know if anyone knows whether, let's say, like some, the young are leaving, and they are young of a particular, upper middle class or middle class people. I don't know if anyone knows what the gender composition or the breakdown of these figures. But if
if you go over to the immigration department on any day, you will find they are mostly young people from the lower strata.
Okay.
It's men and women.
Right. So, but the gendered impacts are also about what happens when men and women leave families, households, what have you. As you identified, we do have aging population. If it's mostly the youth who are leaving, who cares for their parents, right? I mean, that's a really important question to ask. But if it's similar composition in terms of gender of who is leaving, who sends more of the money back to the home, right? Usually the evidence with the domestic workers is that remittances do come back, or they were coming back into the country till 2019, 2020, right? So yes, it matters across the class spectrum, no doubt. The crisis matters across the class spectrum, and my point is, of course, that we're not recognizing that it matters across the class spectrum in different ways, but there is also a gender dimension. I mean, Danusha spoke about something like 1/3 of our population is malnourished. If you look at probably the gender decomposition of this, you will find that there are differences between how girls and young boys are affected, for instance, right? Or how women and men are affected. But yeah, at one level, yes, it is a crisis that affects everyone, and it affects everyone in very differentiated ways. So this stabilization discourse helps a particular group of people, which Dhanusha points out, as Harvard has done. But what about all of Sri Lanka? What about all of the Sri Lankan citizens? But I mean, perhaps Harvard or Dhananath or Dhanusha knows more about perhaps Dhananath, you might have data on who's migrating and why and things like that. Do you? And if you do, then you should shed light for all of us, I think, for all of our benefit.
Dhananath, I would like to ask, you spoke about structural reforms, which will be the key, to come out this crisis. In the fairness of government, now government is doing something, right? And it takes time. You yourself said it will take some time, and people will have to go through pain, some or the other time because of these structural reforms. So in that context, how do you see the stability? I mean, the duration of the stability, and how long will it take if this policy work well?
So as I mentioned, the stability, Shiar, I see it as, stability in the sense, in what sense are we looking at is the first question. So as I mentioned, it's a very temporary, queues moving away and things like that is what is there. But I think even if we, in 1 year's time or 18 months' time, if we fail to do the structural reforms and kick the growth in, we will drift back to where we were, is my estimation. But the importance of the structural reforms is, let's gear to the solutions in. So Professor Kanjana spoke about the gender, the disparity and how the females have been badly affected. On the other side, because of the high energy prices, how with the electricity prices, how this has affected. So let's see how the structural reform can actually address that, because we have to use the right tool. Now let's say because of the high electricity prices or high fuel prices, if I recommend to give a government subsidy to electricity and to fuel, let's see who is getting benefit. Since Shamir is not here, let's get Shamir to this. Shamir drives let's say a BMW, which the fuel consumption is for 1 litre 5 kilometers. We all know these heavy vehicles where the parliamentarians drive, fuel efficiency is very low. So 1 litre 5 kilometers. Where I come in a motorbike, where for 1 litre I can drive 30 kilometers. So imagine a government give a subsidy, let's say 100 rupees for each fuel litre. So for me, for 1 litre I get 100 rupees, which I consume within 30 kilometers. So for 1 kilometer, 30 divided by 100 divided by 30, about 3 rupees subsidy that I get. But look at what Shamir gets. He is getting more, because for him to travel the 30 kilometers, he has to spend like 5 into 6 liters, which is 600 rupees. So by reducing the prices across the board, you are basically benefiting the people who could afford it. And that's what exactly happened in the fuel prices, because 70% of the fuel, we all know, when you're at a very higher income status, your energy consumption is high. If you go to near all Colombo schools, all the drivers are switching on their engines and waiting in the AC from 7:30 to 1:30. So when you give a fuel subsidy across the board, you are basically taking poor people's money and giving it for the people who could afford it. So that's why I said the right tool to use it. Definitely we have to take care of the social safety net. That's why I recommend you give it for the most vulnerable people, because you can, because 98% of our people have the electricity connection. So based on the number of units, you give directly a cash subsidy for them, directly for the poorest people. So then you are not giving someone like Shamir an added advantage on the other side. And it can be easily done because you have 98% connectivity. Same for, let's take the gender aspect. Now when we did a study in 2008, I'm not sure whether you can recall, there was an instance, the female inmates in the Valikada prison went on strike because they were only getting 1 sanitary pad during their menstruation. That was inhumane. And when we checked the numbers on menstrual hygiene products, there's about 106% tariff.
That's right, yeah.
And also on diapers. So who are we going to corner by 106% tariffs? If you recall, this became a so popular topic. Now a lot of people have forgotten. Even one of the presidential candidates was named as like Padman. And even the opposite side, even the other political party, I don't want to mention names, they also admitted that we should bring down the tariff rates. So that's how the cost of these tariffs is causing a lot of poverty. And the same thing that I spoke about, even if you get cost of construction, which is about 40% higher because of these high tariff rates, and that is costing higher room rates on tourism industry, you are having a knockdown impact. So that's why we recommend that you have to address this with structural reforms on trade, because the tariffs has to come down. If Shamir is here, he will witness how difficult it is to trade in Sri Lanka. I mean, you have customs with all sorts of tariff structures where no one knows what's going on, and no one can answer those questions like how the tariff rates have been calculated, and the effective tariff rates are about, for steel, when we checked about, it's 82%, for cement it was about 40%, for wall tiles and floor tiles it was at one point at 108%. So how are you going to, even a small person, to have a small squatting pan and build a small toilet to expand their business? How are they going to do that? So that's why the structural reforms are important on one side, to bring down the cost and to grow the economy. On the other side, that's why we have to have the social safety net to address that electricity problem, that fuel problem, because bringing even to attract the investors, because now we are basically taking from the industries and giving a massive subsidy on the other side. That is basically hampering the industries on one side, and we are losing the investment on one side. And also, if you look at the losses of Ceylon Electricity Board and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, is unbelievable. I mean, we are talking about 200 billion allocation for social safety net. The Petroleum Corporation for 8 months lost 600 billion. That is 3 times of the entire social safety net allocation. That is after this increase, after this budget. Earlier it was just 50 billion. So how fair is that on the poor people's side? So that's why we recommend that these state-owned enterprises, you have to definitely restructure. On the other hand, you have to address it with a structural reform on having a cash subsidy or like a cash transfer system directly, and this amount is not at all adequate. And we have 7 million people below the poverty line, and it doesn't mean no other 13 million are having a good life. They are basically just above the threshold. On the other side, let's take even the food items. Now, I know a lot of people say apples and oranges, why do we import and all that? If you go and check the prices of oranges and apples, people think these oranges and apples are those are consumed by the Colombo elites. Just look at where these products are being sold. It's in front of the National Hospital, or it is in front of the Matara bus stand, or it is in front of the Peta bus stand. People like Shamir who drives BMW doesn't go to the Peta bus stand. It's the common poor people who go and buy this because they can't afford the mangoes and other products. So by having this discriminatory system, we are basically worsening the poverty, and that's why we have to address it with a structural reform. And without those structural reforms, this cycle will repeat. We will drift back to where we were, and we will have the same conversation, and probably the same reforms will come up. And that's the reason. And even if you look at the East Asian example, I would like to show you a very quick, easy chart. These are the trade agreements from Thailand, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. So Thailand, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. About 14, right? Vietnam, about another 13. Sri Lanka, 4. Even the Singapore Free Trade Agreement, it's not in a workable form. But it doesn't mean only the free trade agreements that drive imports and exports. It is the simplification of the tariff structure. It is cutting down the red tape, because you are basically cornering the micro and small medium enterprises on exporting. I met a vanilla exporter from Manikin who came with a backpack with his export products coming from Manikin in a bus. I asked, what should the government should do to improve your exports? He said, the best thing that the government could do is not to intervene. I know, because I have a market, I am earning about $2,000, $3,000 a month, but the government tariff structure and their certifications in their registrations is completely drying out my business. So that's the structural reform that we need if we were to move on the export side. That's why I said even it is not the big investors. It is even a small investor like that Manikin vanilla exporter who probably exports about like 100 bottles of vanilla plant to Germany. It is that the government red tape that is stopping him. It is not anything else. Even for the big investor, it is the land problem.
Now, Dhanusha, you mentioned that about 1/3 of Sri Lankans
Yes.
are now malnourished.
Yes. Children.
So, and those are the official figures, of course.
Yes,
UNDP figures.
Yes, they're not figures that we plucked out of the air around this table. Those are official figures. Now, let's get back to this term stability. As long as that figure keeps increasing, there is no stability, is there? And you know, 1/3 is extraordinarily, alarmingly high, and we have to bring that down to what, 5% or something
It's alarmingly
like that?
high because it went up from 10% or 11% to 33% in a matter of 2 years, right? If I'm not
Exactly.
wrong. Yeah.
So it needs to come back down to 10% before any politician can even use the word stability.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. If I just quickly comment on what Dhananath just said, I think he was alluding to these free trade agreements. Right now, the East Asians have signed. But you have to look into what the East Asians did when they actually was transforming their economies. Now that they have, now we have to look into the theory of free trade, which Ricardo proposed, and what he is saying, if you go into free trade with economies that have equal technological status, that is mean equal labor productivity, and also you open your markets when you don't have unemployment. These are the two key assumptions in the theory, which our free trade apologists tend to very easily forget or tend to never read, I guess. So when East Asia went into free trade agreements with the rest of the world, they had come up to a state that they could technologically compete with them. They did not go right away, like in the 50s, go into free trade agreements. Okay, let's compete with the West. We need free trade agreements. They went into free trade agreements much later on. Even Vietnam, IMF complained about Vietnam in the mid-90s and early 2000s that these guys take our money and build state industries. And this is what the Vietnamese were doing. And when Vietnamese built up, transformed their economies, then later on they opened up. Now they can open up. Now they can compete with even the aliens. Why not? Not when they were in that stage of transformation. In the stage of transformation, they are getting to that stage. Now, I'm not trying to be an apologist of hardcore developed capitalism, but I'm just going into the history where we at least we have completely dipped into this very subtle so-called neo-imperialist economic ideas. They are to perpetuate this third world and first world divisions. And we have to understand that first. So going into your question, so yes, I mean, we have to look into, I think, how first of all the state resources are managed, right? Whether they are managed rationally. And as I think Kanchana was earlier alluding to, 77% of the government revenue is allocated to paying interest, and 95% of that is going into the paying domestic interest, right? And this was around 30 to 35% when it was in 2015, and shot up during this period because in 2022 and 23, because of this crisis, the interest rates went up, shot up, and through that crisis, certain people who are very how should I put it, very accustomed to what is happening in the financial markets took advantage of that, and they swooped up all these bonds, and they did not restructure those bonds. What they, through the DDR, they slashed the incomes of the pension funds and completely left out of the high cost bonds, which are still generating incomes, unproductive incomes. How are they amassing these incomes? This was a particular situation and that erupted due to a unprecedented crisis, and they took advantage out of it. That's why I'm saying they consolidated their position during this crisis, and the amount of that is around 2.6 trillion rupees next year. And through the DDR, we should have brought that down, because now during 2000, the Jubilee debt movement, they came up with a system of parameters like ratios, debt ratios, where countries become stable. You call, for instance, the interest expenditure should be something less than 25% of the government revenue. So taking that example, taking those parameters that are already established, government should have slashed the interest costs by restructuring those bonds, at least bringing down the interest expense. Now one would say, okay, that would destabilize the bank. That is a completely erroneous argument, because this has been done elsewhere also. That didn't lead to a disappearing or vanishing of the banking system, because they can renegotiate the high FD rates, which the bank has also given. I won't go into that. So now what they're doing is they're taxing the people to the bone, that they have increased to up to 18%. Now all these draconian figures which you were mentioning were in 2023. Imagine what would happen after the VAT is introduced and the inflation, because I also want to comment about the inflation figure. Now the price levels have kept on rising despite the rate of inflation coming down from 90% to say something like now 76%, but the price level has continued to increase, but not the incomes. So,
Dhananath, would you like to comment on the first set of statements made by Dhanush, and then I'd like to very quickly move to Dr. Nicholas.
Yes, so my take is different, because I was just basically trying to get the graph on how Vietnam grew their exports. So it is, as it said, like you can argue, okay, they did something at the beginning and then things changed afterwards. But actually, if you look at their export growth, you can see it is recently, while they were signing the trade agreements and when they were liberalizing, or like when they were liberalizing is nothing to like, nothing like to, push something, but it is basically simplifying that processes is made what their exports better. And even in Vietnam, there are about like 4,000 state-owned enterprises that they have restructured. 4,000. We are talking about 500 in Sri Lanka, and we are struggling to do 7 on one side. So that's how the East Asian came up. And even when we had Dr. Veeratai Santiprabhu, who was the former governor of the Bank of Thailand, who did a critical role when the East Asian crisis was there. And that was the same recipe that was adhered. And even if you look at India, if you read Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia's book, who was the right-hand person of Dr. Manmohan Singh, who basically led that Indian reforms in 1991, which is basically accelerating the growth now. What he said was the Indian economy was like a bus which has applied about 10 brake sets. Because no one can, then there was a license Raj in India, and they then basically started attracting the investments and allowed the exports to grow. But it doesn't mean that the government has no role. Definitely the government has the role to regulate, because otherwise, and I think a lot of people have this perception that the market system is you do anything that you do, someone else doing something else. No, the government definitely has a role. Government's main role is to ensure rule of law. Now look at what has happened to our judiciary system. I mean, you have to wait for about 30 years to get a land case resolved. And look at the gender impact from that. And government is not doing that job, and they are coming and trying to do so many other industries. And that's a recipe for disaster. And that's what we have been going through multiple times. If you look at Vietnam, if you look at Malaysia, even for that matter Singapore, of course, all these countries has different degrees of ways of doing it, because of course, it is quite unique to their own demography, to their own way of doing things. So, of course, these have different ways of doing it, but there's no other recipe rather than looking at the external options and trying it. And on the other side, the government can support, definitely. That's what I said, the government has to support by allowing the people to work, because countries are developed not by the government, so governments are representatives. It's a private individuals. You and I have to work and then develop the country. There was no country that was developed by a magical Diyasen Kumaraya or a magical leader. It is the people who has to contribute to the development. But what government could do is allowing the people to contribute. Like for women, 52% of our women labor force participation is very low. So we have to allow them to contribute, and then only we can move as a country. I will try to show that graph as soon as I figure the graph.
Sure.
Can I
Thank you.
quickly make a quick comment about
Sure.
this? Now, before you export, you should be able to produce, first of all, right? Before you can't immediately enter the export market, specifically in these high-tech or very sophisticated products. What the East Asian governments did was that they made the initial investments, they made the initial change in the mode of production, and then private sector sort of absorb those impulses to change their own mode of production, and then only these free trade agreements were signed. Then these exports expansion happened. But there's a whole history before that. Where state intervention played the absolute key role, and there were so many books written about this. Nobody can deny this. You take the Meiji state of Japan, and following that South Korea, Taiwan, and then later on in Vietnam. So all these states played a key role in building up their industrial structure. Then later on, once the productive capacity is built up, then only they opened up and then went into exporting. Before you export, you have to produce. That's what they did.
In the interest of time, again, I'm going to ask the two economists to be okay with having competing opinions. Dr. Howard Nicholas, when we take economic stability, political stability and policy stability, where in Sri Lanka we're also looking at an upcoming presidential election. So we need policy stability to be there. We're also talking about corruption vulnerabilities in Sri Lanka. We're so accustomed to maladministration. How must Sri Lanka's economic recovery and a path to economic stability move forward, progress without any obstacles in the light of all of these competing interests?
It's too broad for me to actually address with one answer. But if someone came to me and said, give me a couple of things that you think are really important for policymakers to address in order to push the economy forward, apart from what I've discussed with interest rates and the Central Bank Act and all the rest of it, so I won't labor that again. There are two things I think that are absolutely vital. One is food production. So no industrialization strategy ever worked without a domestic food production strategy, which made food plentiful and cheap. And at the moment, we're far away from that, and we're destroying domestic food production by allowing all sorts of imports. Now, we're doing that because actually we've created a problem for ourselves. And the government is trying to solve that problem by getting cheap food imports. But what they should have done from the beginning is identified the agricultural sector and said, this is really important for us to get cheap and plentiful food, because that is also a way you can keep wages down. The East Asians have done that very successfully, and they give lots and lots of subsidies for agriculture, lots of income support to farmers for agriculture. But the second thing, which has been labeled by many people the silent killer. We were talking about this before because I'm going back to the 1990s, and there was a discussion on the currency, the value of the currency. Now, if you go to the central bank's report, they say it's fine, it's competitive, and the governor has repeated it many, many times. But I asked some business people who told me the same thing, but actually were confused because they were suffering. They were suffering, they were being damaged in the export markets. I said, have you looked at the McDonald's index of Sri Lanka's rupee value? The McDonald's index. It's in the back of every Economist magazine, and you just go to the site. Against India, we are 55% overvalued. 55% overvalued, and we have a free trade agreement with India. This means every business has to reduce their costs.
So the prices do not match. So obviously when you look into the exchange rate situation, it looks as if it's overvalued, which is absolutely correct. But then it's the solution would be to bring down the energy prices, as opposed to, I think, because, as you very correctly said, Professor, because it would affect the rest of the population, like it would be like a tsunami. So going back to your question, so yes, I think the rationalization of government expenditure, which is I was trying to explain. I mean, even at a situation like this, where 1/3 of the population is like, suffering under immense economic pressure, the government has a week ago increased the food allowance and clothing allowance of the military by 75 billion. So, I mean, a humongous amount compared to what the social security spending is, something around 180 billion. And this is on top of the allocations that they made to 2023 budget. And so what are they saying? They are increasing the repression mechanism, or the repressive machine of the state, expecting resistance by the ordinary people. And this is what they're doing. They're passing laws, one law after the other, suppress people's free expression and right to protest, right to resist, and also now strengthening the machine itself that would crush the resistance that is I don't know, I mean, would erupt at any moment. So one thing I mentioned was to reduce this interest expenditure, which is highest in the world, 77%. Second in line is Ghana, somewhere around 44%. And we know where Ghana is. It is even worse. Now, what it shows is that now a certain section of the private sector not only has captured the revenue streams of the government through privatization of profitable institutions, they've also captured the expenditure side through interest expenses, right? So we need to shift that. We need to look at how in the system the income distribution is happening. So this has through the crisis, they have consolidated. There's a redistribution from the normal people to a section of the corrupted business elite in the system. So we need to address that problem. Secondly, I would like just quickly mention this. We could say, in a way, I am also pro-privatization. But what should we privatize? We should privatize the unproductive, cost wasteful assets of the government, like these luxury vehicles, right? Now how should we do that? Now there is a re-export mechanism in a different way. There is a mechanism for re-exports of used vehicles in Japan. Now what are they doing? They use the vehicles, then they send it back, wherever they want in the rest of the world. Now how can we say these luxury vehicles that are actually eating into the foreign exchange, fuel, spare parts, you name it, will not be purchased by someone else outside the country? Because these are super luxury vehicles. You can re-export them and use that is, you are transforming an unproductive assets into foreign exchange savings, and then you can channel that. Right. You then extend this to the private sector also, if that is successful.
Our topic of discussion tonight was economic stability, fact or fiction, myth or reality. I'd like to now close the discussion for our closing remarks by our four eminent panelists. I would like you to focus on tonight's discussion since 9:40 p.m., focusing mainly on the fact that we have austerity measures in place which have impacted the standard of living and quality of life of the citizens. But as to be solution oriented, how must policy makers use data, use science, use the expert skills and knowledge to ensure holistic and inclusive policy responses to enable citizen-centered sustainable development? And how must citizens be more engaged, more involved, have more agency in the policies that are made for their betterment? I'd like to start off with you.
Well, I've always been in education, and recently, because of the forthcoming presidential elections, people have asked me, so what advice would you give the government, etc. My answer is, I wouldn't give the government any advice. What rather I would like happen is that we should be able to give some education to politicians. We should be able to explain to them some of the fundamentals so that they can take more informed decisions. And it's not just the politicians, but also their entourage, if you like. Because at the moment, these decisions are just whims, you know. Today they listen to one person, next day they listen to somebody else. And I'm of the view that they actually do have the interests of the country. You know, I don't believe that all these people are corrupt and have malintentions, etc. But what I do believe is that, especially when confronted by, let's say, foreign institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and so on, they get bamboozled by all these concepts and all this jargon, and it appears that these people really understand, so they go along with lots of the policies. Now, I think that's where, for me, one of the problems lies, is that there is a lack of education of our leaders of, let's say, the fundamentals, so that they can make a discerning decision about what policies to implement and what they should push to the side, if you like.
All right, fabulous. Thank you very much, Dr. Howard Nicholas. Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura, your closing remarks.
Thanks, Sonali. So, Dhananath quite a few times mentioned about how we need to have social protection and that needs to be robust. One of the things that, what we have with ASVASUMA, which follows on from Samurthy, is a targeted welfare system. But globally, there are calls for universal social protection by 2030, which is only 6 years away from now. And this is to implement and achieve SDGs. You talked about sustainable development goals at the start. In some of these discussions, we haven't really touched upon what, are we even working towards the SDGs? What SDGs are being neglected? Who do we leave behind? So I think I would really be wanting to push for universal social protection for communities. And to be honest, Sonali, I think, I mostly research around labor. I think the workers are well aware of how they're being shoved around, right? It's not that they don't have that consciousness. The Aragale really kind of stirred it. It's still there. The point is about nurturing that and honing it in the same way Howard was talking about politicians. For me, the agency of the citizenry is also equally important, but that does mean giving them the space to let their voices be heard, right? And this is against the backdrop of what we talked about, acute food insecurity among Sri Lankan households, inflationary pressures undermining projections of increased projected poverty, and input shortages, which is affecting livelihoods of both some of Sri Lanka's most vulnerable, the daily wage workers, which is about, I think, 2/3 of our working informal sector, 2/3 of our informal sector, but also smallholder farmers, right? And against the backdrop of real wages, we have to be cognizant that if we are serious about both equity and heading towards sustainable development goals, we really need to be kind of changing tacks and thinking much more broadly. Structural change in terms of recognizing structural inequalities as well.
All right, thank you very much. Dhanusha Patirana, you're a very critical panelist. I would like you to perhaps channel your inner hopefulness and look at possible solutions, the way forward from the multitude of crises that Sri Lanka has faced.
Yeah, one thing I would like to say is that we can actually learn something from Argentina, how they handled the debt crisis post-debt crisis in 2001. They actually did not abide by these IMF conditions. They negotiated directly with the creditors, if I say that, and got a 70% cut on their debt, right? So now what is happening through IMF program? We are sacrificing everything under the sun to repay the debt, and what are we getting? We don't even know. right? So the foreign creditors have proposed a plan, a draconian plan, I should say, where they agreed to a 20% cut, and to make the NPVs, that is what you call the net present value of the debt, to equal to the one that was formerly issued, they raised the interest rates, right? Which is even worse than what we had. So they raised the interest rate something like 6 to 9%, as you might see. So whereas what happened in Argentina was that the government declared, look, most of the debt that has been borrowed is odious. In a way, what they said was, look, this has not been utilized in a way that benefited the public, which is the same story which our Auditor General's department is saying. 67% of the debt that was externally borrowed between 2006 to 2021 does not reflect in our assets, but they were borrowed for that purpose, for investing in state projects. So to give you an example, the Southern Expressway was $6 million per kilometer. The expressway between Oman and Saudi Arabia was less than $1 million per kilometer. This was built 10 years after that. So can take inflation into account, you see what has happened is far worse than what the numbers would say. So we need to take these things into account.
Dhanusha, that wasn't very positive, but okay. Dhananath Fernando, if you could, in your closing remarks, also touch on the importance of trade and investment, seeing as that Sri Lanka is going into a very expeditious process of trade and development in terms of entering into free trade agreements, etc.
Sure. First of all, I'm also saying that we should not go to IMF ever. The only way that we could do is to having an economy which is functioning well, and that's the only way that we could going back to IMF. Otherwise, the 18th program is very close by. The only way that we should avoid going to the IMF is the structural reforms that we need to do. We should not allow the state-owned enterprises to make losses, because then it will have a multiple impact. We should get our social safety net right. That's the only way that we can make sure that our poor people have an equal chance to come back and contribute back to the economy. We should allow our investors to come, even for the smaller people, to contribute back to the economy. And that's why I am critical that the government should not intervene in business, because if you allow them to intervene, they will bring something like the online safety bill to the rest of the industries as well. And I will rest my case with what happened in Japan, because Japan, when they grew, they had this very powerful ministry called JITI. They were the one who were deciding which industry who should do. Do you believe that that same JITI said to Mr. Toyoda that this car industry won't work? And he took the courage and he built the Toyota on his own. And the rest is history. And that's why I'm saying the best thing that the government could do is just stay away and allow the people to do their own business. And we should do the structural reforms, and structural reforms are focusing on that. And when we have that, this is the graph of what happened to the Vietnam exports in the left-hand side. As you can see, from 2008, it is picking up. So that's the power of the structural reforms, and that's the only way that we could avoid an IMF like what India did. They went to IMF in 1991. Afterwards, they never went. I hope they will not go. But if we do not do the structural reforms, the next conversation would be on the 18th IMF program.
All right. Thank you very much to our fabulous panel of guests, Dr. Howard Nicholas, Dhananath Fernando, Dhanusha Pathirana, and Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura. Thank you also to Niresh Eliathambi and Shihar Aniz. Just before wrapping up, the Constitution of Sri Lanka in Article 27 speaks about directive principles of state policy. And it says, and this is important, to be read out at 11:20 p.m. On a Wednesday, the state is pledged to establish in Sri Lanka a democratic socialist society, the objectives of which include the promotion of the welfare of the people, the realization by all citizens of an adequate standard of living for themselves and their families, including adequate food, clothing and housing, the continuous improvement of living conditions, the rapid development of the whole country by means of public and private economic activity, the equitable distribution among all citizens of the material resources of the community, and the Constitution goes on. We have stressed throughout this program the importance of instituting inclusive policies and strong support mechanisms to pave the way for greater equity and inclusivity. Economic stability, fact or fiction, myth or reality? Let's wait and see. Thank you for watching us. Good night.